Good afternoon, everyone. We're just waiting a minute or two for everyone to get into the webinar. Okay, I guess that we could get started and people will come in as they come in. Good afternoon. My name is Jeannie Hampton Rizzucci. I'm one of the family specialists here at WID, and we're part of the one of the regional support centers, and we're doing a webinar today with Naomi Brickel on shifting the mindset, rethinking the IEP process. I also have here with me some other family specialists, Denise Lopez, who will be doing the interactive session with Naomi, and Lisa Chedsley, excuse me, Miriam Franco, and Marcel Pachel. So we'll get started. Next slide. So one of the things I just wanted to mention is, in order for everyone to hear the session and to reduce all the background noise, all the participants will be muted. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand on the raise your hand feature, or you can type into the chat box, excuse me, on the screen. We will review and answer questions during the Q&A at the end of the webinar, and actually during the webinar as it pertains to the conversation. This event is being recorded, so it will be available later on for all attendees and anyone else who is interested. So I thank you all for coming. I have the pleasure of introducing Naomi Brickel, who directs the WID Community Support Network and Public Policy Initiatives. Her areas of expertise include student and family engagement, post-secondary transition, and self-determination. Naomi is a mother who raised a large family of children with and without educational disabilities and IEPs, and has worked with, excuse me, thousands of educators and families over her career. Naomi will share her perspective and key takeaways from her experiences. Welcome, Naomi.
Welcome. Hi, everybody. Thank you. And Denise going to be on our screen too, I think. So let me just quickly introduce myself. Thank you, Jeannie, for that introduction. As Jeannie mentioned, I am the director of the Community Support Network at Westchester Institute for Human Development, which we call WID affectionately. And WID is a university center for excellence on developmental disabilities. We're one of 68 in the country and 3 in New York State. And my 3 partners are here. And I know all of the family specialists come from the different USEDs in New York. The mission of a USED is really, I think, summed up in community inclusion. And it's really about helping people with disabilities live quality lives included in the community. And so I kind of came to that myself, those values myself, through my personal experiences as a mom, but then landed here when I was hired to direct a state education department grant to develop and direct a parent center 12 years ago. So I feel very fortunate to have kind of had a career land in my lap that fits so strongly with what's important and passionate to me in my life. And my career really came out of, as Jeannie mentioned, I have a large family. I have 6 children, 3 of whom had or have IEPs, and all very different types of experiences. I have a daughter with an intellectual and developmental disability who has a very rare genetic mutation and disorder. I have a son who has a learning disability. I have another son who has who's just struggled in his academic process with no real clear diagnosis. But so, you know, when I kind of entered into special education with my daughter, who's now 24 years old, it was huge learning curve for me as a mom. And it was very intimidating, very stressful. And I kind of dove really hard in to learn everything I could. And when I just began to start to think I had figured some of it out, my next guy came along with completely different issues. And so it's been quite a roller coaster, and it's been about a 20-year roller coaster with my kids and my career. And I'm really happy today to be able to share some of the experiences that or some of the, I hope, wisdom that I've gained from my experiences, both as a mom and as a professional in the field.
Thank you, Naomi. I am just going to give a brief overview. Hello, everyone. My name is Denise Lopez, and I'm a family specialist at WID. And I've spoken with Naomi a few times, and we just have a lot of chemistry and a lot of things that I felt that she would be so eloquent in explaining to mothers, professionals, caregivers, and the like in such a way where it wouldn't be talking at anyone. It would be having this integrated dialogue, this interactive dialogue, and to gain some understanding beyond just the IEP and what other surrounding issues that we all have gone through, and to see that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. So I want to begin by saying that this is going to be a conversation based on equal partners in the IEP process, individuals as part of the conversation, meaning the children, the young adults that are going through these developmental and otherwise other issues that they're going through to have an IEP and being part of that process. And finally, a parent and professional's perspective, engaging and understanding the IEP process, which is a very large and confusing path to take. No one knows it initially. And it's always great to have support systems that can enlighten us on how to go about that process. So
Denise, can
Naomi,
I just chime in just on
please.
just what you just already shared, because I think there were 2 things you zeroed in on that I want to just get to. One,
Thank you.
The intimidation of the process, and 2, the nature of why we chose this format for our dialogue today. As you were speaking, I was reminded when I was very early in, when my daughter was probably 4 or 5 years old, and she's now 24. I had a friend who was helpful for me. Like, she was a neighbor, and she was kind of helpful to me. She understood the legal aspects of special education better than I did. And she kept telling me, you need to call this other person. She's like, you need to call her. She could really help you. She's really good. And I kept not calling. And finally, this friend, she kept saying, you need to call her. You need to call her. And one day she said to me, you need to call her one more time. And I said, you know what, Carolyn, I said, this is why I feel terrible, but this is why I haven't called her. I don't know what to say. And so I think we were both very deliberate today in choosing a format where it wasn't me standing up with a PowerPoint slide, speaking at you as an expert, because really this process, when you're early in it, can be so intimidating. And I think the first major message I want to share is pick up the phone, even if you don't know what to ask. Find a friend who's been through it, or has a little bit more knowledge than you, and don't ever hesitate to ask for that kind of support.
I wanted to speak on that, Naomi. You know, when you go and hear about AANA, there's always sponsors for people that need that support, that coach that kind of can get you through and encourage you. And for some reason, that's not here. And I've always thought that that's like something that we all need. We need someone to say, hey, look over here, I can help you. This isn't just a black hole you fall into and just keep falling into. So that I want to speak to that, because we're calling this a mindset. And can you explain what that is? A mindset, the shifting of this mindset, just mindset in general, before we get into
Sure.
the specifics of it.
Even before I address that, I want to just address also just the coach mentor aspect. And I just want to, there's two, I think it's really important what you just shared. And one of the things I've really tried to do over my career, or at least at one point was trying to focus on, was really reaching family members of individuals with IEPs while they were still in preschool, where you could have an opportunity to take a little bit of that intimidation of the burden off in order to create an opportunity for the mindset to develop with a little less threat, hanging over it. Because when you enter in a system that is so complex, so legally prescribed, there's New York State, and here in New York State, we have, I think it's like 268 regulations that go above just the bare minimum federal requirement for special education. So yeah, when you come into this, it's a little scary. So there's two things I just want to say on that point. Down here in especially in Westchester County and the Hudson Valley and Long Island, it's a lot more prevalent to have special education PTAs. A lot of the districts in these regions have SEPTAs, we call them. They're not quite as prevalent in other areas of the state, but I really encourage everybody here, especially if you're a younger parent, if there is a SEPTA in your district, get involved with it. I see Yvette Gorovich just chimed in the chat box, and I'm going to share a little bit about how she wrote me into SEPTA when I was a really angry mom many years ago. And I'll talk a little bit about that more as we keep talking, but so the SEPTA is one thing. And if you don't have one in your district, then maybe talk to your special education administrator and say, how can we at least form some sort of a group so that families can network both amongst each other and with you? Because really the process works much better when everyone involved is having a glass of wine together. And I say that somewhat, flip, but a lot of our SEPTA events were also social events. Sometimes they took place in a restaurant. Sometimes they typically took place in someone's house, at least for our executive committee. And it was inclusive of educators and parents. And that really helped create a trusting relationship within the process that I found very valuable, because I did not go into the process at all trusting. And so, I had a lot of issues. I thought I wanted to sue my district, and it was really in conversations that I realized we weren't really far apart at all. In fact, we had the same values. Again, we'll talk more about that. So that's one thing, the SEPTAs. And the second thing, this is a good opportunity for me. I am going to I'm going to post it in the chat. There is a really great training. I'm going to post a bunch of links in the chat just so that I don't have to do them. And then what I'll ask someone to do is, if you could just post these, if somebody could cut and paste them, and just every 15 minutes or so repost them, because I think we might have people coming and going, or people come back.
That makes sense.
But one of the links that I'm about to post in the chat is the very first one, is our parent member training. And I really learned, and I think we're going to talk a little bit more about this, Denise, but I really learned I became a mentor for many families in my role as a parent member, but I also I gained much more from my role as a parent member.
Absolutely.
So, and the training, the link to that training, we have that training in Spanish, we have that training throughout the region. It's virtual, but I highly encourage that training for not only if you, whether you want to become a parent member or not, but really it's a really super overview of the process. And I guess I'm bragging a little because I wrote the curriculum.
I was just gonna say, are
But
we
yeah,
gonna say
now I feel I shouldn't have said it, but I really do think I did a super job. But I have to say the state really, they hovered over me and encouraged me to bring out some of the message that they really felt were important. But it's a really, and I had a co-writer too, who was a special ed administrator, and we did it together. And I really think it's a very, very good overview and really helpful to kind of shift the mindset from this is me to this is us mentality in the CSC process.
Yes. And what do you think is that this is me and this is us looks like? Is that an adversarial sort of
so I think there
dynamic?
are a lot of,
is that
I
what
think
it
there
is?
are a lot of dynamics that cause the CSC process to have an adversarial feel. I think, well, one, and I'm just going to call out the elephant in the room. I am a mom of a child with a disability. I'm a crazy parent because I can only be, I'm going to give this to a vet who's a participant and was my special ed director previously. She's here in the audience, and I'm sure Yvette, you can wave because our camera's on. But I attribute this quote to her mother, may she rest in peace. But a mother can only be as happy as her least happy child. And when you have a vulnerable child, you carry all the angst, the pain, the worry, the concerns, and you are bringing that into the process, and it's impossible not to. So when you're, as a mom or dad, as you're sitting around that table, you really are, and not to diminish the roles of the professionals at the table, because I think if they're passionate about their work, they're emotionally involved, but you're the only one who's really bringing the heartstring emotion to that process. And I think it's really important for us, if we want to be considered credible and be credible parts of that team, we need to be self-aware of that and make sure that we are engaging within that process professionally, and that we're just mindful of the emotion we bring in, and that we treat others within the process with the appropriate professional deference, and finding ways to agree or disagree professionally, even though it's really hard when you're a crazy mom, when you're a mom who's anxious, worried, and just wants to make her kid better.
I don't want to get too far into the emotional component just yet, but I wanted to just ask you, when the mindset shift is spoken about and you're engaging families or professionals in that conversation, how do you go into it? How do you begin?
So let's go back to just, the adversarial piece. Like, there's so many areas where shifting the mindset, I think, is important, but let's zero in on this one about the adversarial piece. When I began the special ed process, when my daughter was in preschool, and even for the first 3-4 years of that process, when I would go to my IEP meetings, I would walk into that meeting and it would be me in my head. I was going to a meeting at the district, and the district was one side of the table, and I was one side of the table, and it was two sides of the table. As I became a professional in the field, I started to understand the legal framework of IDEA, and IDEA is our special education law in the country, and in New York State, it's the Part 200 regulations that implement that federal law, or that special education law. But the more I learned, and I really learned this Part 200 regulations I used to be able to quote like what number and thing. I was really interested in it. I was very passionate about the regulations, and I brought that knowledge into my meetings and to my professional career and to my meetings as a mom and a parent member. But something I probably when writing this, when writing the parent member curriculum, because there's a whole section on the regulations, I realized that not that I hadn't realized it before, but what the members of the CSE team, the first one listed is the parent. And the CSE team is made up of the parent, of the school district administrator, of the student themselves, when appropriate, of and other multidisciplinary professionals. And, you know, the intent behind that is really important to consider if we're going to make the most of this process and all of these people on the table. And the intent of that was that, I guess to take the words, the African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. But when we're in the CSE process, like our kids would not be getting special education services if they were not complex. If the issues for them accessing their education were simple, then they would be fixed with a 5.0 floor plan, or they'd just the teacher themselves in the classroom. But if their issues rise to a level where they require special education services, then they're complex. And it takes a village to kind of develop an appropriate program. It takes the insights of that parent who really knows that kid inside and out, who puts that kid to bed at night, who knows what makes her child, comforts her child, who knows what triggers her child. It takes the professional expertise of the special education teacher who's gone through a graduate master's degree, and has had hopefully years of experience in a classroom working with kids, with similar and different special educational issues that our child has. So that's a real professional expertise. The school district administrator who would have an expertise not only most likely of that classroom and those theoretical frameworks and the actual probably experience in practicing in the classroom, but would also have a real knowledge of what is possible, these are how the regulations and the framework of this system works. This is what's available in our district. How can we pull these pieces together to make something work? You have, a school psychologist or whatever the related service, all that come with their own levels of expertise. So one of the things that was really important for me, and that happened really as I became more educated as a process, is that I started to shift my mindset from a kind of insecure perspective of myself as the parent, where I felt a little intimidated. I felt like, look at all these people, they're one side, I'm the other, to start to realize that actually I'm just bringing a different type of expertise that's equally important and equally credible, equally important, and valuable to the development of this IEP and this program for my child.
Wonderful. I want to know, and we spoke about this before, what was that epitome, that shift for you that happened at that time, besides you having the education piece, because that empowered you when you would go into these meetings, but when did you realize I have to think of not me versus them, but us together?
Well, I think the credit for that goes to Yvette, who's, so let me just introduce Yvette. Yvette, you can wave again, but Yvette Gorovich.
Hello, Yvette.
Formerly the director of special education in New Rochelle, and she was the director of special education when I started my special ed career as a parent, 20 years ago. And as I mentioned, I was a very angry, anxious, and well-educated parent so I was going in with all the guns. And I did go in with all the guns, and I can be a little bit fiery too. So I went in with some guns, and sometimes I went in with my guns like a guerrilla, warfare, because I would sneak in behind closed doors.
I understand.
Sneak up the elevator and show up in her office without, going through security. Sometimes I'd show up at her door because she happens to live 2 doors from me. Yeah, which was, I think, probably a little bit uncomfortable for her, maybe for a short
Probably.
while. But I was very clever in gaining access to someone who was really busy because I live in a really large district. But one of the things Yvette did very effectively, and then I proceeded with me, was when I went in angry, instead of putting her wall up and starting to put her ducks in a row to defend herself, she put the wall down and just listened to me. And my anger, I didn't even know what I was asking for. In fact, I started to learn what I was asking for from Yvette's prompting questions from my anger. I knew I was angry, but it took her probing questions to get more out, like to help me speak more, because I didn't have enough knowledge and I was emotional to realize, oh, I think what you're looking for is an inclusive program for your daughter, because I was really angry. I think I didn't know it at the time, but this original issue was my daughter had started her education in the same school that all her siblings went to, but in second or third grade, the program that was recommended was outside the school. And so all of a sudden, this whole support system she had me of siblings, neighborhood kids, you know, riding a bus with kids who she knew would have disappeared had she gone to another school. But I didn't even know. I just knew I wasn't happy with what they were recommending. I didn't know what I wanted, but her probing questions and her active listening enabled me to articulate it more effectively. So I think that helped. I don't think it did it all. It was all in. I think Yvette's pretty exceptional in that she has, I think, managed to rope in every parent who wanted to sue her and get them to be their SEPTA president. So I was just one of a long list of family members who wanted to sue Yvette, who became one of a long line of women who we all consider ourselves very strong former SEPTA president moms.
That's wonderful.
And a lot of us active in the field. A lot of us went on to make careers out of our work in SEPTA.
Ladies, can I jump in from the chat? We just had a question, which I think is pertinent to where we are in the conversation about when families or parents are feeling that their concerns are minimized by the team. And could you address that a little bit?
Sure.
That's a great question, by the way.
So, you know, I have to like be very transparent in that my experience of my kids and my learning curve of this process happened not within COVID. And I think that the dynamics that COVID has brought into this process are huge. It's brought in much more significant complications for our kids. It's brought in a lot more emotion and concern for us as moms and dads. It's brought a huge amount of stress to teachers and educators and administrators in the field. So I'm going to give that response based on my experiences before COVID, but during COVID, you know, I'm not going to, I can understand where the team dynamic may not feel quite the same and that issues may feel diminished because of such a high level of intensity right now. But, you know, I often felt that my issues as a mom and my worries of my child, about my child, were only important to me. I felt sometimes that, like, well, Yvette, you'll remember one time that Yvette used to say that my child had, you know, mild to moderate disabilities. And I would be like, no, they're really severe. Like, I'm sorry, I live with her, they're severe. And, you know, but it was this perspective she had as an administrator for 1,400 students, whereas my perspective was my angst, worry, concern about my ones. So, you know, a lot of the glass ceiling that I created for my daughter, that Yvette always said, you know, I don't have a crystal ball, but this is what I see. Mindy ended up following the path that Yvette had kind of envisioned that I hadn't because of my angst and worry. So one thing I'll say to moms and dads is, I got to say parents, I'm really sorry if I keep diminishing dads, because I don't mean to at all. It's just, for me, I'm talking about my personal experience. And in our family, that's how it was really, I was the one who took it on. So please, dads who are here, I really don't want to diminish that at all. I'm just speaking from my own experience. But so from one perspective as a parent, I would just say that sometimes what feels like there's not enough angst or energy around this deficit issue that we're seeing is more just, it's a broader perspective. There may be like, they've been there, done that. That doesn't diminish the intensity of your concern and the reality of your concern. Right. So I say, again, I say to family members, like, remember that there's different perspectives that we all bring to the table, and there's different professional approaches we bring to the table. So that's one piece to consider. But to educators, I also need to share that, I have spent a lot of time working with educators and know that the regulatory compliance, all of those issues are really heavy. And I've said at times to state education department officials, you guys have created a system that every person who's responsible for implementing puts themselves in a position of liability, because it's impossible to implement these complex regulations perfectly. Like there's too much gray, there's too much that. So for educators who I know, when they're sitting at a CSC table and dealing with so much of the dotted I's and crossed T's and programs and thinking about where to fit kids, and they're thinking of how many kids are going to fit in this program, it's really important to remember that this one kid is the kid of the meeting, and this one kid is the kid of this parent. And there is nothing, there's just nothing small about an issue of your child, whether it is big or small in the eyes of comparatively to the other kids that this administrator or educator might be, working with.
Yeah, so self-advocacy within what you just said is the common denominator, I think. And a lot of times, I don't think all of us parents, mothers, dads realize that we are in a career as a parent. This is not just a job, this is a career. It has more weight. And we have to know that we're not just self-advocating for ourselves, it's for our children, it's for our unit. And that in itself, I believe, is very overwhelming for a lot of people. Like you said, during COVID, before COVID, of course, but like after COVID, it's brought on other elements, other variables that we weren't dealing with before. And so it makes it a lot more complicated. And I just want to give just a quick quote from Carl Jung, and he says, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and we'll call it fate, and you'll call it fate." And so a lot of times we don't know that our unconscious mind is really seeping into the way that we interact with anybody. And on top of which, we're in these meetings and we're feeling very defensive. You utilize education to lower those defenses. So, what happens when a person that isn't in our positions of, we're in this professional lifestyle and we have sort of an advantage to a degree? What happens when there are parents that don't? How do they shift that mindset?
Well,
how would they do that?
When you're talking about making the unconscious conscious, there's so many places I could go with that. For parents, as I mentioned when we first started talking, realize what you're bringing to the table and to your interactions with administrators, because like I don't know how many people are football fans or sports fans, but like every once in a while you get this great superstar player, right? And all the energy's on them, like they're the best, they're like there's so much money, they got these multi-million-dollar contracts, and they end up not being successful because they're so self-centered, they're so all about them that nobody even wants to work with them.
Right.
And I often used to say to family members, like, if you want to be considered a credible member of the team, you have to practice good sportsmanship. You need to know the playbook. You need to educate yourself on the process. You need to be thoughtful and plan. Like nobody's going to throw somebody a football in a game if they haven't been to practice all week. So or if they come in without their uniform, like they just don't play. So I once was in a CSE meeting where the school psychologist was presenting her report, and it was on yellow paper. And I was like, I'm sorry, like, are you handing that to me? She's like, oh no, you can't have this. I didn't have a chance to send it to the typist yet. It has to go to the typist before you can have a copy. And I was like, talk about unprofessional. I had such a hard time listening to a word she said for the rest of the meeting because she had not prepared. And yet there were times where I would come to the meeting and I thought I was really prepared because I had put a lot of thought into it and I had bulleted in my head. But when I got to that meeting, because of my emotion, it all went in a blender and I could barely articulate a thought. So over the years, I started to learn that when I bulleted my thoughts in my head, I also needed to bullet my thoughts on paper. And I even developed, and in the chat box, I put a link to resources. Very early on, when I came to WID and was working on the Parent Center grant, I developed a template document for families to prepare for their CSE meetings. And basically it followed the IEP. It's called the Parent Student Report Worksheet. It's really simple, but it helps a parent come up with information that they can jot down. They can even submit it to the CSE and it becomes part of that record where they can be thoughtful and mindful and prepare their role for the meeting.
Preparation for me is key. As long as I have those bullet points out, I can go around with the nuances of things rather than just go through the meat and potatoes of things. So I think that's a really good point to bring to parents and caregivers, that you don't have to think of absolutely everything at one moment, in one meeting. And I think a lot of times the humanity sometimes gets taken out for some reason in our heads, that we have to be perfect, that we are failing if we don't rise to the occasion the right way. And that in itself can make us sort of just fall back and not fall forward, not self-advocate. And I wanted to, like I said, being a parent in this arena is a career that will go on for whatever determined amount of time. And there was a question that someone posed to me, which is, I really want to get to, Naomi, and it was, every family situation and needs are unique. How do you start to take a step back and look ahead to make or create and then implement the changes needed? How does this process look when parenting and caretaking are indefinite?
All right, so
that's loaded.
Well, it's not only is it loaded, but it's zeroed in on something I think there's a few things that my years in the work and in my personal, that there's a few like really big ideas that I think are really critical that I wish I had known earlier. And one of those is this, that for me and for most family members I know, when they go to an IEP meeting, it's a meeting that's about what are the issues and what can we do to, like, what kind of services do they need to address them. So imagine if instead of focusing on those problems and talk about making the unconscious conscious, like imagine if we shifted the energy of that meeting from won't problems, extras. Imagine if we shifted it and in preschool, we started talking about this child in front of us and we started to talk about, what are the long-term goals for this kid? Do we see college? Do we see a job someday in the community? Like maybe it's a child with, or maybe we don't even know yet, how severe these, like with my own daughter, we didn't have a real, the manifestation of her disability came over time. But imagine if we started that preschool CPSE process with, okay, I'm going to do my own daughter here. Okay. She's 24 and she now is in an employment training program that hopefully by June she'll have a job.
Awesome.
She's been to an inclusive college program where she wasn't matriculating, but she lived on campus. She made friends and she learned a ton of skills towards independence. She takes Ubers herself. She goes out with friends. She goes out to dinner. And like I said, I think we'll have a job in June because she's really grown so much. But imagine if that process for me had been the very first meeting had been like, well, like, what are the long-term goals? Like, are the long-term goals that someday she'll live and work in the community? And imagine if every CSE meeting started with that long-term goal as the framework, or at least the big idea that the whole framework happened within. Imagine if instead of in preschool, our meetings started by like, usually this is how the meetings start. Okay, today we're here to talk about like Lily and how her progress is in preschool. Mom, do you have anything you'd like to add? Yeah, I'm really worried about this. And then the school is like, oh my gosh, we're worried about this too, because like, we don't know how much longer he can stay, she can stay here because like, this isn't the right program. We think she needs more support, boom, boom. All of a sudden it's gone from like, and even every report starts with, Janie is an adorable child, and then boom, and then it all comes in and smacks you. But imagine if we really started with the goals and we really tried to change that process. Like the most important part of the IEP, even for a parent who wants to have accountability measures, is realistic goals. Because if you were to focus, let's just say you are a parent who's not very trustful. If you were to spend some time really focused on what the goals, those annual goals are for your kid, you would have a meaningful, accountable tool when those goals weren't met. But if we are instead too focused on the problems and the services, where the goals might just come after with not enough attention. And I really believe that it would make the process more collaborative.
Right, but what's the balance there
more
though,
positive?
Naomi? Yeah, like what's the balance if somebody was to say, I'm gonna play devil's advocate, and there seems to be more deficits or more challenges than victories? How then does this meeting go? How does this shift happen with everyone? Because sometimes it's a little difficult sometimes to get to that place if there's certain hierarchies not met.
All right, so let me throw it back on you then, okay? So we've got major issues we're worried about, right?
Yeah.
Major issues, like whatever they are. Even that, if we are coming from a goal-oriented process, we still have the big goal in mind, but we got to zero in on, okay, well, so here's some bumps in the road, like here's some big, huge fences that we need to figure out either how to get around, over, or break down in order to get to the goal. And even then, the approach to the deficits becomes one that's constructive rather than the deficits being the center of attention. So I'm in no way trying to discount addressing the deficits. As Yvette can attest, I had lots of deficits that I needed to ensure were addressed over the years, and we did. But I still believe that had the process kind of started with the goals and the future, it may have felt a bit more constructive as opposed to, this. Honestly, my CSE meetings were a stress mess for a month before, or I'm not going to say a month, let's be realistic. It was probably a couple of days before. I was really stressed. I was usually a little bit traumatized after. And quite honestly, even within those meetings, for most of the time, I think half the stuff that I was worried about, I didn't even articulate because either I felt intimidated or, there was a plan coming together and I thought, oh, maybe, or something, or it got too long, or other issues got heightened. So I think if we could really make a deliberate effort to be focused on, as both parents and educators, what is the goal here, and try and structure meetings around that. I think it could be very, very altering to the experience.
Right. Now, when you talk about being affected the way that you were going into the meetings and post meeting, how then would you have been able to say, if your child is able to be involved in the process, not just in the third person, but actually be involved if they're a little bit older, maybe, how would this parent usher their child through if they themselves are not in a place where they can regulate self, I guess is my question.
All right, so I'm going to tell you a story, and again, so I know that other parents will say, well, this doesn't really resonate for me because my child has much more significant disabilities. But when my son was in 4th grade, or I guess he was in 3rd grade, don't ask me why, I must have read something. He's now 22, but I was not in the field, but I decided to bring him to his annual review meeting. He had a pretty significant learning disability, was in self-contained classes for his math and English, and could not read at all in elementary school. Maybe like the 3-letter words, but really was not, did not access information from written text, even probably up until high school. Anyway, in 3rd grade, I brought him to his CSE meeting, and he was very upset with me for making that decision. He sat there, he didn't speak. Yvette was chairing it, so she'll remember this meeting. He never said a word. He glared at me the entire time. So I never really said a word either, because I was just so upset about the mistake I'd made. Yeah. Towards the end of the meeting, Yvette, we've made the decisions. We've recommended the exact same program for the following year. Special education, math, and ELA, and then the other classes, inclusion classes. So it's the end of the meeting. Yvette, in very layman's terms, explains this to my son, what the program is. And he says, the first words of the meeting, so does that mean, and he's not a big talker anyway, but he says, does that mean I'm in special ed for math? And we're like, yeah, because it's going to be the program very similar, like we said it in nice little flowery language, but basically, yeah, because it's the exact same thing as last year. We're making no changes. And he said, because I think I'm kind of good at math, so I don't think I need special ed for math. Okay. So guess what? We changed the whole program. He adjusted the program and everything. So great, right? That's cool. Only the following year, when he started the program, he goes to school. He's the only kid in his group, this group, that has that recommendation. So the teacher, who had not been in the meeting, doesn't note that one little difference on the IEP, and he gets put in special ed math. So this is months later, right? He comes home in September from school, and he's like, I told you that meeting was so stupid. I can't believe you made me go to it. It was so dumb. So I was like, I don't even know what you're talking about. He reminded me of the meeting. I was like, what are you talking about? He's like, because I'm in special ed for math. I'm like, no, you're not. I said, Johnny, what happened in that meeting last year is the law. What was recommended is the law. You can't be in special ed for math. It's a mistake. He had a nice teacher. I knew her from my other kids. I called her up and she was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. It's this slight difference on the IEP. I missed it. I'll fix it tomorrow. So I said to him, and so sure enough, he went into the regular class and wasn't in special ed for math for the whole year. So my lesson to him was, or that I said is had you not come to your meeting, you would have been in special education.
Absolutely.
But even if we had been smart enough to realize you didn't need it, you still would have been in special ed for math, because I never would have found out until December, and I would have forgotten. I've got 5 other kids. I wouldn't have remembered. Of course. So he never missed a meeting after that. He came every year, and that young man, I have to tell you, created his IEP every year with literally, while Yvette and I would be debating or fighting or talking or filling the room with our hot air, he would usually have a one-liner that he'd throw in that would just change everything. So, there are different ways, and I've done a lot of work over the years about including students in their IEP at all different levels. And there are ways to include a child in their IEP development. And it may not be that they're in the meeting for the whole meeting, and it may not be, but there's some component that the very, very least, I'm a huge advocate that every child should know that they have an IEP and it has goals, and they should know what the goals are. And they should I would love every day or every week, look at those goals and speak out loud the progress that they have made towards those goals. Because at least then they know what they're in it for. Otherwise, they just think they're in it because they're stupid. Which is what, and I know that's not great language, but that's why these kids, without being educated about what this is all about, they make that terrible assumption that they're there because they're not smart.
Right. And just as last question, so we can go into whatever's going on in the chat or any other questions that anyone would like to ask you directly. The preschool component, when you're at that level, you're ready to transition from, or you're in or going to preschool, transitioning out of preschool. At that point, the struggles versus strengths, how then do you deal with that at that point, and how can these little ones be involved in their IEP process as well?
I think for every, it's different. And I don't necessarily know that a CSE meeting, reviewing reports is a place for a preschool student, but a review of goals with a child, even at that age, not necessarily the goals as written as the IEP, but putting them into language, and a review of that, I think is healthy for everyone. We do it with our kids without,
Of course we do.
We set goals.
With other
when
things.
We teach a kid to tie his shoe, we set goals, and we talk, we start with the first part and then maybe go to the loop part. But, I just think it's always good to have a child as much engaged in the conversations about their disability as possible, because again, the assumptions that they make themselves when, we think we're protecting our kids and we're not. They just make the worst assumptions rather than really how many of us judge our kids because of their disability? I don't know anybody who judges their kid about their disability, but they will judge themselves about their disability if we don't educate them about it.
Yeah. Just before
ladies, can I jump in here, because we're getting close on time? There's a couple things in the chat. A couple people were really talking about feeling judged by CSE members or professionals, or encountering perhaps some pushback from the school. So we talk a little bit here about changing the parent mindset. Can you maybe touch on some strategies about changing the mindset of other people in the room when you're trying to, think bigger and more broad?
I think my experiences have taught me that the same values I have for any interaction, my work, like when I've had a difficult boss, or my work when I've had a difficult client, or my family when one person has different viewpoints and I think they're totally out there and crazy, and yet I still want to maintain that family relationship. I think, it's important to never give up your realistic, reasonable, points and what you bring to the table and your expertise as a parent. But the reality is, in life, we're gonna meet people who are defensive. I think I've encountered many educators in the CSE process that are really amazing educators and have great confidence in their skill. And when they have that confidence, what they bring to the table is different than someone that may not have the same skill set or the same confidence, or may just bringing other dynamics. I'm thinking of that same school psychologist who brought the yellow paper, who just always was so defensive. I can remember one time she was telling me that my daughter was a bully. I'm like, she's in 3rd grade and she's got autism. Like, I'm sorry, like Like, it was immature. That was an immature comment.
Right.
And we
right,
are going
right.
to meet immature, uninformed, and people who aren't the top quality, no matter where we go in life, even
That's right.
10 times more in COVID, as we know. Right now, everyone's on edge. But I think there's also really incredible educators. And I think if we come to the conversation, if we're well educated about our rights, if we speak them reasonably, and if we can have conversations without getting overly emotional, then you know what? There are times that we are going to hit brick walls. But for the most part, in my experiences, if you've got a quality educator sitting in front of you, you're going to have a good conversation about outcomes.
Thank you. We have another question about clarity. How much clarity should parents seek in terms of what warrants special education eligibility? I'm guessing that's clarity from the team.
So it's really interesting. In my work, I have gotten so many families that I've spoken to in my 12 years who are really looking to come in. They're looking to stack their deck to get that eligibility, to get that IEP for their kid. And I get it. You want your kid to have the supports they need. But I also get that outcomes for kids with IEPs, the graduation rate for kids with IEPs, the amount of inclusion for kids with IEPs, like the outcomes, the data isn't great. And I often say, if you have a district, if you are working with a district who is saying to you, we don't think your child qualifies for special ed, walk away, throw your hat in the air and say, kudos to me. Great job, mom, doing what I need to do. Because let me tell you, if there's a teacher in the classroom and they have a kid struggling in front of them, they are going to do all they can to advocate for that kid to get services, even from a selfish perspective. How that kid does on state testing impacts that teacher. How that kid's behavior plays out in a classroom impacts that teacher. And so if your kid needs support, the teachers in the classroom are going to be advocating for it. And if they are saying to you, and I can't say this is the case in all everything has its individual, but my kind of big light bulb after all these years is, if you're working with a district and they don't think your child needs services, maybe walk away and just be grateful and let things play out, because you can always re-refer. And if your child continues to struggle, you can always come back to the table. But I just feel that, IEP is not, it's also sometimes comes with a lowered ceiling of expectation on the part of the educators, and also a transference of accountability from a general education classroom. When that kid has an IEP, all of a sudden that kid becomes someone else's responsibility rather than his. And I can't tell you how many kids I've seen who are taught by teaching assistants and aides instead of classroom teachers because they have an IEP.
Yes.
Anything else?
Lisa, were there any other questions?
That wraps up the chat questions. I combined a couple.
So
we have about 1 minute left. I don't know if you have
I have one thing I'd really like to share. I have one last piece I'd really like to share, because I think it's really important, and it happened to me just a couple of nights ago. So I mentioned I have 6 kids, and I mentioned I have a child with a learning disability who went to his own meeting and advocated his whole career. He said to me once, "I wish you hadn't made it so easy for me. I wish it'd been harder, because now I need to learn to work hard, and it's much harder for me now." So fast forward, okay, he said that, and of course I felt like, God, I can't do anything right. As moms, we do that to ourselves all the time. But fast forward, he's 22 years old. He's really just followed this path to where he wants to be, which is in commercial construction and real estate. And he's landed himself this internship that will happen this summer. He's 22 years old. And I woke up in the middle of the night after he got news that he got it. And I was anxious and panicky. I started to think, oh my God, he has to be in the city at 7:30. He'll never be able to do that. How is he ever going to get up? Well, in the middle of the night, was spinning on everything I knew he couldn't do. And I stopped myself. So you know how you said conscious of unconscious? I've been really working on that lately. And I stopped myself at 2 o'clock in the morning. And I said, I've been doing this to him his whole life. I've been bringing this energy of what he can't do and putting them on him like I'm doing it right now. So I like did all this meditation at 2:30 in the morning. And the next morning I got up, and when he walked in the room, I was like, I am so excited for you with this.
Right.
And you know what? I have made such, like, that is my thing. I just couldn't believe it struck me. I've been doing this to him for 22 years.
Yeah.
And it's got to stop. He's
gotta
gonna
stop.
be fine. So please, when your child is in the room, let the love in your heart be the energy that your child feels. And when they go to bed and you go and you're sitting by yourself or you're spinning in the middle of the night, let your worry happen then, but let them not feel your energy, your anxious energy. Let them only feel your love and heart. That would be, if I could share my biggest piece of wisdom that I think after all these years, I would like to add.
Thank you so much, because I was going to ask you if you had any words of wisdom, and that just encompassed all of it, I think. And so this was wonderful. Thank you so much, Naomi. We really appreciated you coming on and hosting, basically. I was moderating, but you took the show, and you brought more than we anticipated. So.
All right. Well, I would love to do it anytime. I think it was great, and I love this format. So thank you. I really appreciate
it. Thank you, everyone. It was so wonderful.
Everyone.
I added a survey to the chat. Please, we'd love your feedback about this presentation and future presentations. And I've also gathered all the resources. We'll be sure to email those out to everyone that registered.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, ladies. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Take care.
Bye. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.